Hi, everyone. I am Kelly, and this is Vote Her In. Vote Her In is a collaboration between Two Broads Talking Politics and Rebecca Sive, who is the author of Vote Her In, Your Guide to Electing Our First Woman President, which excellent, which we still haven't quite done, but we have a woman vice president now, so we're all very excited here. So I am going to turn this over now to Rebecca, who will introduce tonight's guest. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, Kelly, and great to be here. And what a great start we're off to here. We spent a couple minutes beforehand preparing and giggling and talking seriously. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Our guest this evening is Julie Scelfo, who's an amazing author, reporter for the Times and the Newsweek magazine in years gone by. But she wrote a book called The Women Who Made New York, which was published, I think, in 2016. And it's one of those books you want to keep right next to your bedside. It's inspirational, it's thoughtful, it gives us good ideas about what we're doing, why we're doing it. And when I was thinking about tonight's broadcast toward the end of Black History Month, the beginning of Women's History Month, of course, Julie's book is full of stories of women of every kind and color. I thought, what better person to talk to about what she's learned from doing that research, writing that book, how these women not only built New York, but built the nation. So welcome, Julie. We're thrilled to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So why don't we just kick off with your talking a bit about your how you came to the book, your life as a writer, now as an activist as well.
Well, so my background's as a journalist, and I actually had never been that interested in writing a book because I love sort of getting to work on different topics at different times. But one of my earliest editors was the director of Seal Press, and she sort of every once in a while would check in with me and say, "When are you going to write a book for us?" And she actually had the idea for this book, The Women Who Made New York, because she had noticed that people keep reading shorter and shorter books these days. Also that there hadn't been anything done on all of these amazing women. So the original vision for the book was to feature 25 women who quote unquote made New York. But being a journalist, I have this bad habit of investigating everything and, kind of trying to report it out. And I started asking myself, what does that mean to make New York? Who deserves credit for making this city? And what are the parts of the city that matter? And so I began sort of researching every single facet of city life that I thought was emblematic of what New York is, from, the culture or the arts, Broadway, to the industries like finance, advertising, but also the people and, the food. And so I also researched different ethnic groups to find out who were the leaders in different communities and different neighborhoods. And so what happened was I realized that, of course, there were so many women who had made so many contributions, and that I needed to figure out a way to talk about them and sort of challenge myself to figure out, how do you talk about people and credit people without creating the same errors of omission that have happened so many times. A lot of times activists use the word erasure, and I don't always think that's exactly the right word. I mean, the effect is erasure, but sometimes it's just narcissism. People are focused only on their own world and their own community, and they don't pay attention to the rest of what's happening around them. And so I wanted to figure out a way to be more inclusive. And so what I did was I created about 40 chapters, which are all of these different facets of New York life, including more esoteric things like the Liberators, and those were women who fought for liberation, or the caretakers, the women who fought to make sure we had good public health, or who took care of children, helped new mothers, and from there, what I discovered, and I think readers also appreciated, is you see how the changes and the progress that happened in New York really spread out to the rest of the country in many cases. So that was how I did it. And, in a perfect world, there could be 100 more volumes, and every single woman would be included.
I want the Women Who Made Chicago.
Right, exactly. Wouldn't that be fun?
Well, I want to write that book, actually. I envision doing, it's been something that's been on my mind a lot the last couple of years, and figuring out how to do it. What I'd like to do is 3 or 4 more books, maybe 5, of other major American cities: Chicago, Atlanta, New Orleans, San Francisco, possibly LA, maybe a city or 2 in Texas, because I think the same formula really could work. And I think that there are so many amazing women in all of those cities, and they really are part of the fabric of the American story. And I want them to be household names. The challenge is the sort of book industry. There's not that much money to be made if you go smaller than New York. So another option might be to do the Women Who Made America and just do one bigger volume. So that's a possibility, but we'll see.
Just to follow up on that, Julia, one of the things I was thinking about in the context of Vote Her In is, and it's a point you made just a moment ago before the show started, that but for those women, we wouldn't be marching, we wouldn't be voting, we wouldn't be electing women to office. I'm wondering if you could share with us and our viewers and listeners, what you've seen from what they did that resonates today, that motivates today.
Absolutely. As I was researching the book, I got the project in 2015, and they wanted the book out by the 2016 election. And so I did the whole thing in 9 months, which was crazy. But this was all during this election where Trump was coming up and, went from being sort of an unthinkable candidate to being the Republican Party candidate for the United States. And so in this time, we were beginning to have all of this increase in very vicious language about women. We were having nasty talk about immigrants in a way that we really hadn't seen as openly before in the immediate sort of preceding decades of history. So as I was writing and as I was looking at these stories, I realized, and I admit one of my biases is I've never been that interested in history. The reason I'm a journalist and all of my writing has been about contemporary American life, because I don't know, maybe it's because I grew up in Virginia and I was surrounded by like Civil War stuff, and I was like, another, Civil War battlefield. But I was just not interested in history. I thought it was so boring. But when I was reading these stories about these women who faced these incredible, horrible injustices and how they contended with it, I realized that, we humans, we're just a stupid species, and we just keep repeating the same mistakes over and over again. And so it wasn't hard to see what these women faced and the choices they made as really comparable to the situations we find ourselves in today, and the same battles women and other people are fighting today. So, there was a lot of lessons, and we can go into specifics if you want.
Well, I want to follow up on the lessons in a little bit, but I also want to make sure we talk about the artwork in this book. So we've had some episodes of Vote Her In talking to political artists and talking about political art, and the illustrations in this book, The Women Who Made New York, are just gorgeous. They're wonderful, and I think they really help bring these women to life. Can you talk some about that process, about working with an illustrator, about seeing your vision of these women then sort of coming onto the page?
So I was so fortunate to get to work with Hallie Heald, who's an incredible, incredible young artist. She sort of before moving to New York a few years ago, she challenged herself to do a portrait a day for a year so that she would have this robust portfolio. And Seal Press put us together. And so I was so lucky about that. But when it came time for her to do the portraits, Hallie had her own sort of research process where she would look for every image she could find of a character. We would meet together, and I would talk about this the person, sort of who I understood Shirley Chisholm to be, who I understood Ella Baker to be, what I thought motivated them, and what they were like during their life. And then she would do this sort of visual review and look at images at different stages of their life, in different moments. Whenever there was video footage available, she would watch it to see their expressions. And then she would independently, make a composite in her mind and then create this illustration. They are remarkable. Her work is remarkable. I encourage everyone to check out her Instagram account or her website. It's hehdesigns.com. But she sometimes shared sort of process photos where you would see the layers that she would do. She works in gouache paint. But I made the decision about who would be illustrated sort of in partnership with my editor and her. But one of the things that was really important to me is, to sell a book, you need to have some well-known names and some famous people. But I wanted to make sure that this book didn't only show women looking a certain way. We don't all look the same. People have all different types of bodies, all different colors, all different styles, all different weights. And it was important to me to sort of show that. So I went out of my way to make sure, I wanted this to be an inclusive book because I think that's more accurate. And I didn't think you could have a book about New York City that was only included people of one ethnicity or race. I just thought would be really, first of all, inaccurate, but second of all, really boring and stupid. So, we went out of our way to include a diverse group of women. And by diversity, I don't only mean their skin color, but again, how they identify. There was a woman in the book who was a lesbian and used to dress like a man, primarily because she didn't want to stand out at work. She was one of the first women to ever work in the New York City Health Department. And she didn't want to talk about the fact that she was a woman. She wanted to talk about medicine. And so she would dress as a man every day. So we included her. We included women in different places and stages in their life. So there are women of all ages featured in the book. And one of the highest compliments Hallie ever got, I'm working with a colleague, Heidi, on a different project, so I had the wrong name in my head. But one of the nicest compliments she ever got was from Dr. Uma Meiserkar, who's in the book, who, when she saw her picture, her portrait, she said, I really flattered with everything you wrote, but I don't understand why you chose this photograph. It doesn't look exactly like me. And I said, Dr. Meiserkar, that's not a photograph. That's an original painting. And she was just flabbergasted. So anyway, I think Hallie's work is beautiful too. And that's how her process works.
When you were talking about earlier about there are women everywhere, like these wonderful women in New York, one of the things, what I remembered is I know you're a big fan of Ida B. Wells. And when you write the book about Chicago, she can have pride of place, I think.
Absolutely.
And I also have been a fan of hers since I was in graduate school. When I was studying the women of the progressive era in Chicago, and she certainly was an important part of that. But, in terms of the lessons as well, she's a really great example, right, from a century ago of a woman who was both a writer and an activist who figured out how to really have an important, influential role in the public square. And I'm wondering, how you think about her in the context of your own life and what you're doing these days.
She's my hero. I mean, she's an amazing person. I've always been a fan of hers. I'm actually I donate to the Ida B. Wells Society, which is this organization some of my former colleagues at the time started to try and get more journalists of color involved in investigative reporting. But she was fiercely her own woman. She was an incredible journalist, and she also was just her moral righteousness was just so clear. And what I find is that even people who are very devoted to treating other people well in one capacity of their lives or one facet of their lives, they don't necessarily pay attention to the other facet. I remember having an argument many years ago in a newsroom when Britney Spears shaved her head and the media was covering it, and colleagues who said, oh, it's all stunt and she, so what? And I'm like, looks to me like someone's having a crisis, and like, where's compassion for this person? And is this news? Is this appropriate that all of these cameras are standing around there and selling pictures? And, why do these things have to be mutually exclusive? So, Ida B. Wells is just somebody who, saw so plainly what was wrong and how fearful people were to talk about it, and she just refused. And one of the things that I love about her was that she just let the facts speak for themselves. I mean, it wasn't like she was even she did the work, and she presented the information, just the facts, and they're so powerful on their own that it changed the course of history, but I just give her all the credit too, because I can't imagine the personal pain she was in. She lost some of her friends to these angry white mobs, and I have actually been in touch with her granddaughter Michelle Dester, who has this book out.
Right.
I'm actually interviewing her next month for Women's History Month up at the Mount. But Ida B. Wells is like, she should be on a coin. She should be, she's one of the most important women in American history, I think.
And can you just talk for a minute about how she combined that role of being a journalist and an activist, right? Because that's something that is important these days as well. And I imagine a lot of women who are interested in journalism also care deeply about the issues and are wondering, how does that work?
Well, that's a very timely question. And this is something that, we see is being played out in real time at the New York Times. As a journalist with a big news organization, I certainly, for most of my career, would never identify as an activist. And I think there's very good reasons to have these boundaries in place about what your role is in a particular situation. When the boundaries get muddled, it can make certain things more complicated. I have almost never reported on politics, for example. But when the Donald Trump got elected, and he was someone who demonstrably did not care about facts and was willing to lie to people repeatedly. And as someone who has devoted myself to facts and to treating other people with dignity, and who had just finished spending all this time reporting on these amazing women who had marched in order to make these changes happen in society, I couldn't not participate in the Women's March. I was like, I couldn't, how can you not honor what these women had done? And even though the media doesn't always talk about it like this, I mean, the Women's March was the largest mass uprising in human history. I mean, I was in New York, and the millions of people in the street, I don't think were ever fully counted. And I remember feeling very surprised and finding it very strange that there were no helicopters or planes going overhead, which there normally are. But I guess they had banned flights that day. And I don't know if that's so they could limit aerial photography, because that's something that can be used for crowd counting. But anyway, so I began at that point, and after writing the book, feeling more comfortable openly talking about the fact that I have biases, because everybody has biases, whether you acknowledge them or not. You're biased based on where you grow up. You have biases depending on your height, your experiences, all those things. And I do my best to acknowledge my biases and say what they are. I mean, I know what most of mine are. I believe deeply in human rights and that everyone should be treated with dignity. Those are my biases. So I bring that to every interview that I conduct. And I also, do more work now talking about media literacy, or what I call media savvy, because I think journalists need a more robust vocabulary to talk about these things. I mean, I make the ice cream analogy sometimes. My bias is towards mint chocolate chip. Like, I don't care what shop you send me to, I'm always going to prefer mint chocolate chip. Like, that's my flavor. But, can I, excuse me, I'm getting a phone call. Sorry. Am I able to to put my bias aside and give an objective report on, how a ice cream store is doing, find out what the facts are about its business, its revenues. Yeah, I'm capable of doing that. So, it's not as simple. This country loves to sort of, pretend everything's a binary, but it doesn't quite work like that. So anyway, I just think we need to talk about it and be more open about it, because that's the media environment that we're in now with social media. It's broken down a lot of these walls that we used to have, and you can't pretend, you can't just sort of ignore them.
I think the best part about being a podcaster rather than a journalist is, when I write to invite people on, I'm like, I run a progressive women's podcast. Do you want to come on? But it's important then to be clear with the audience, with the guests, with everyone, that is the perspective that we're coming from. But it is very different than journalism.
Yeah, but this notion of right and left has become so oversimplified. And, I'm seeing now, people on the farthest left seem more like people on the right in some ways, and vice versa. And so, what does progress mean? I mean, for me, especially learning what I learned about Eleanor Roosevelt, who's in my book, for example, she authored the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I think this is one of the most important documents that's ever been written. I don't know why we don't teach it in schools, but this notion that every human being is entitled to be treated with a certain amount of respect. They're entitled to dignity. Everyone's entitled to privacy for their body, for different things. How did we put these rights into words? And to write this thing was this massive undertaking that she did with the help of several other people. That, to get all the member nations to ratify this thing was this incredibly complex task, and they did it. And, I view sort of the work of civilization as this long, slow process, way too slow, of trying to get our stupid species to learn how to use words and how to talk and communicate with words instead of actions, or certainly violence. And it's a difficult, long process, And so to me, the progressive movement has always been about going closer and closer towards a civilization, a society that's more just, that's more inclusive, that does a better job of protecting vulnerable people, vulnerable for whatever circumstance, and being able to talk about and address these things. So, if baked into journalism is wanting to stand up for the underdog, wanting to uncover truths that may not be readily visible to everybody, and holding power to account. And so those values, I don't think, have changed. And I think it would be helpful if professional journalists were able to sort of verbalize this stuff a little more and help our readers understand. I don't think we've done as good a job as we can do at educating our readers why it's worth spending money and hiring professional journalists and getting your news from professional sources, as opposed to TikTok, where, my 10-year-old got a recipe to make spare ribs the other day, and they were very good, but, it wasn't exactly like a tested recipe that you might get at a trusted magazine.
Yeah. Are there through lines in the lessons from these women as you were writing their stories? Are there either individual lessons that were really compelling, or things that, sort of patterns that you saw, themes that were emerging?
I like that question. I do think, after writing this and spending so much time talking about them and thinking about them, I noticed that all the women in the book fell into one of two categories. Either they were sort of artists, like really original thinkers who just really needed to express themselves, and they weren't going to let anything stand in the way of that. You've got Laurie Anderson or Patti Smith or, Louise Bourgeois, who just needed to do her thing. Grace Jones. I mean, look at these women. there's no one else like them. They just had a vision and they became who they were. Or they were women who noticed that other people were suffering or were struggling, and they were like, I'm going to help them, and I'm going to do whatever it takes to help them. You know, Margaret Sanger gets brought up so often in the context of abortion rights, but people forget, you know, she got her start because the Comstock laws prevented doctors and nurses from talking about sexual health. So poor women didn't know anything about contraception. They didn't know anything about how to protect themselves against STDs. And we had this massive health crisis in New York when all these immigrants were coming from new places all over the world, and they were all sharing germs. So diseases were rampant. Women were sick. Infants and children were dying at ridiculously high rates. And if you were affluent, you could go to your doctor, you could get somebody to tell you. But poor women didn't have access to healthcare, and they didn't have access to information. So Margaret Sanger's fight for years and years and years was simply to be able to talk about this stuff and to talk about contraception. And then she was an advocate of help, you know, to get women contraception, and even help develop contraception. So, you know, that's really what most of her work was about. You know, she didn't want anything to stand in the way of helping women. Clara Hale was this amazingly gifted, loving woman who had a gift for taking care of children. And she lost her husband at a young age, and she wanted to be home with her own children. So rather than go to a job far away, she started babysitting, and she would take other people's kids in. But like, whereas I have 3 kids and constantly feel like, you know, my head's going to explode, like she would take a dozen kids and it was like nothing. She just had this, she was a baby whisperer. She like got kids and they loved being with her, and she got more help, and she eventually expanded her facility, and she ended up being a foster mom to over 50 kids. And she not only would take care of these kids, but she would see when parents were struggling, and she would help them and teach them, kind of like provide basic education that wasn't always available to everyone. And, you know, eventually when the crack epidemic happened and when AIDS happened, you know, she was taking HIV positive infants and crack addicted babies before the city was. The city came to her to get her to teach them how to manage these things, right? And she did all that not because she was looking to be famous or she was, you know, trying to make a lot of money. She did that because she cared, you know, and she gave a shit. And she gave a shit about these other people and these neighborhoods. So, you know, that's the through lesson with all of these women. And it's the same thing I see in activists today. I mean, look at Lucy McBath, you know. I mean, she lost her son, you know. If you looked a mother in the eye who's lost her son, like I mean, I can't think about her without just having the most appreciation for what she's doing, because she has nothing left to lose, you know, and she's just doing what she's doing as an advocate to try to protect other moms, you know. And I think that's where, you know, there are a lot of people who have different motivations and more self-interested or interested in power. But there's a lot of people who are just trying to make the world a better place. So,
and you know, that's exactly, I think I would just say personally, I think that's why we're here doing this. We want to see the world a better place. We think that women in positions of importance and value and in their neighborhoods and around the world can do that. So I think maybe we'll end on that very inspirational note, Julie. It's such a treat. I have to just say that, you know, on the Voter In podcast, several other writers have been with us, as well as the artist that Kelly mentioned. And it's great to both learn and be inspired and say, yes, I am going to curl up with that book one more time. So thank you again for being here, and I hope you'll come back.
Oh, my pleasure. I really love what you're doing too. And you know, getting more women into office, I think, is a really key part of making these changes. I think that we're headed in the right direction. So
thank goodness.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.